I was told to pick a topic for Chief Grand Rounds that's something I'm really passionate about. And personally, I had a hard time finding something I'm passionate about because I have really one emotion, and it's anger in varying degrees. So I think I spent as long trying to find a topic for Grand Rounds as I did actually making my Grand Rounds. I spent a long time thinking, like, what's something that's really important to me? What's something I look forward to all the time? And then I think on an afternoon trip, I had an inspiration. It's coffee. Coffee is something I've looked forward to and has gotten me through some rough days. So I just want to talk about kind of the physiology of caffeine and the history of coffee. It will get fairly boring, and I apologize. I don't have any disclosures, but I'm probably moving to a place that doesn't have a Starbucks. So you might notice a dip in the Starbucks stock in the near future. So I apologize for that. Prepare your portfolios. And also, I'd like to thank Dr. Kenneth Conley Coleman for helping me find a good theme for my PowerPoint. They don't have a coffee one in PowerPoint, which seems insane. We'll start off with the science of caffeine. So coffee is actually a very persnickety plant. It only grows in certain areas. There's a region called the Bean Belt, which is in between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, where coffee grows really well. Even in those regions, it's still very specific just because you have to have the right elevation, the right amount of sun exposure, the right amount of rain. So not even all the places in this region can actually grow coffee. The coffee that we drink is the seed from within the cherry of the plant. Each cherry contains 2 seeds. After you plant a coffee plant or tree, it takes about 3 to 5 years to start producing flowers and cherries, which became a factor in getting plantations up and going as it became popular. In the wild, the trees can go up to 10 meters tall, but commercially people try and keep them around 5 to 7 feet tall just because it's easier to pick berries, not 10 meters in the air. There are 2 different kinds of coffee species. Arabica is the more common kind. It's sweeter. It is a little bit more temperamental as a plant, but the other one is Robusta. It's hardier, as the name would suggest, but it has less sugar in it, so it doesn't taste as good. It does have a higher caffeine content, though. It ends up being the kind of coffee that's in instant coffees most of the time. So now, getting into the really exciting physiology of caffeine. It's the most commonly consumed psychoactive substance in the world. The average American drinks about 180 milligrams per day, which is about 2 cups of coffee. But we're 22nd in the world in coffee consumption, which I think we could do better. The average person takes about 3.1 kilograms of coffee per year. Finland and Norway top the list, and they take in 9.6 and 7.2 kilograms per person. So the way that caffeine works is through competitive inhibition of adenosine receptors, specifically the types A1 and A2A. Normally the A1 receptors inhibit release of neurotransmitters, so caffeine will cause a tonic release of dopamine, which makes you feel good. Less good is that in early brain development, its antagonism of the A2A receptor can slow the migration of neurons in the brain. Caffeine is absorbed in less than an hour by the small intestine and reaches peak concentrations in saliva about 45 minutes after you ingest it, and then it reaches peak concentrations in serum about 2 hours after ingestion. Normally, the half-life is about 3 to 7 hours in adults. In neonates, that half-life is up to 130 hours just because of their immature kidneys and livers, but they reach adult levels within 6 months usually, which I thought was a really impressive turnaround for their metabolism. The half-life increases about 8.3 hours in women who are pregnant, and oral contraceptives can double caffeine's half-life. It's metabolized primarily in the liver by the cytochrome P450 oxidase system, specifically CYP1A2. Smoking doubles the caffeine clearance, which is why one paper I read thought that maybe there is a higher rate of coffee drinking among smokers just because it takes more coffee for them to be able to get the buzz. Alcohol increases the half-life of caffeine and decreases its clearance. They found that if you are acutely taking in caffeine, you can improve your performance on memory tasks and increase your alertness, which I think we're all fairly aware of. And then another thing that they noted is that the effect of caffeine is greater in situations when you expect poorer performance on these memory tasks. So if somebody's in caffeine withdrawal and you give them caffeine, they do better, which I feel like makes sense. But also if they're sleep deprived and you give them caffeine, they'll do better on memory tasks. And then some less desirable effects of caffeine. It can cause hypertension, both systolic, tachycardia, and it does that through a combination of increasing intracellular calcium, norepinephrine release, and dopamine receptor sensitization. It can also cause vasoconstriction by binding directly to the vascular smooth muscle cells, or even cause vasodilation by increasing nitric oxide synthase activity. Then, because of its effect on blood vessels, I actually recommend not taking in caffeine right before exercising because it can reduce your ability to increase your blood flow to your myocardium as it's having increased oxygen demand. So some people who are using the pre-workout should maybe reconsider that if they like having functional hearts. But whatever you want to do. So back in the 1800s, people were trying to figure out what the lethal dose of caffeine in coffee would be. So some unfortunate rabbits in an MIT lab had OG tubes placed and had obscene amounts of caffeine in coffee given to them. And they estimated that the lethal dose would be about 150 to 200 cups of coffee for a 154-pound person. But in reality, when you try to drink that much coffee, it causes gastric irritation and you throw it up before you would actually die from drinking too much coffee. But after that information came out, there was a rage in trying to see how much coffee you could drink. And I think the person who did the most was like 70 or 80 cups in an 8-hour period. I think he was pretty alert after that, but very alive. Most common reason or problem people have with caffeine overdose if they're drinking coffee is just a tachyarrhythmia. It's when you're taking in more than 3 milligrams per kilogram of coffee. But if people OD on stimulant pills or diet pills, they can actually die from caffeine. So it is serious. Moving into the history of coffee, there's a lot of fun origin myths that are probably not true. The most popular one is about Kaldi, who was an Ethiopian goat herd, and he was out with his goats, and he noticed that when they ate a certain red berry that they got really excited and even danced. And naturally, like you do when you see animals acting funny after they eat something, he decided he should eat some of those berries, so he did. He felt really good afterwards and decided he needed to take it to somebody and share the effects of these berries. And so he took it to the local monastery, and the abbot there thought that it was probably sacrilegious to make him act that way. So he threw the berries into a fire, but they smelled really good because it was just roasting coffee. And again, naturally, since the stuff that he threw in the fire smelled so good, they raked it out and then ground it up and mixed it with water and drank it. And it was delicious. So coffee became popular in Ethiopia that way. Kind of the thing that makes me believe the story less is that the first time it was written down was in 1671 by that guy, whose name I can't pronounce, which is a theme for most of the names in this presentation. And prior to that, no one ever talked about Kaldi or dancing goats or anything, and there are no local sources that confirm it. So that's probably just a fun story that somebody told him. Some other fun stories, a sheik that was exiled in 1258 found the berries and he made them to a soup, and it cured all of the illnesses in the surrounding villages, got him back into good graces with people. Another story is that the Archangel Gabriel saw that the Prophet Muhammad was getting sleepy, so he made him some coffee, and Muhammad is reported to have said he felt so good after drinking it, he could unhorse 40 men and make 40 women happy. And then another story that starts in ancient times, but actually does extend to current times, is about the civet, which is this animal over here. It's a relative of the mongoose, although they call it a cat. It's inaccurate. Civets really enjoy eating coffee cherries, and naturally that's what they do. So they find the best coffee cherries, which means in their excrement is the seeds of the best coffee cherries. So they think that maybe that did help spread the region that coffee was in, but in current times, the coffee beans that you can get from their excrement, I believe, is the most expensive coffee that you can buy, which is disgusting. But in reality, what probably happened is that somebody noticed that they did feel a little bit better maybe after eating the coffee berries. So the Oromo people of Ethiopia would grind them up and mix them with animal fat and make them into like a paste, and they rolled into balls, and they would take it with them and eat them for energy. Other tribes would use the berries to make a porridge or a wine. What's kind of interesting is that prior to the 1600s, there's no record that people are using it for a stimulant. And there's really no other stimulant that people have. So the question arises, what did people do before you had coffee? And the answer is, you had a very relaxed schedule. Prior to the 1600s, a lot of clocks would just have one hand. So you just generally knew what time it was, but you didn't have to be somewhere at like 3:15 because you can't tell what time 3:15 is on that clock. As we started to advance our knowledge of astrology, we put a minute hand on, and you need to be places at certain times and get up in the morning, and coffee really helped facilitate that. So coffee in literature, the first time that we believe that coffee is written about is in a book by El-Razi, who was a physician who lived from 852 to 932. It's reported that he wrote about it in a text that he wrote, but that text is lost to time. At that time, bun was the name for the coffee plant and bunchum was the drink. And he notes that it's hot and dry and very good for the stomach. The first time that we actually have an extant book that talks about coffee is the Candid of Medicine. And he describes bunchum as hot and dry in the first degree, and interestingly, according to others, cold in the first degree, which seems like the opposite, but no one questioned that. And this was really important and medical training throughout Europe up until the 1600s. So Europeans would have at least known generally about coffee or a coffee-like substance, but they weren't exposed to it until much later in time. Coffee was first described by Europeans in 1573 by a German physician and botanist. And based on the reading that I've done, it seems like around the 1500s, European physicians and botanists were just wandering around the world judging people. They really enjoyed it and wrote lots of stuff. So, like I had mentioned previously, coffee started out as a solid snack, but around 1000 AD, people started mixing the coffee beans with boiling water to make a drink. At that time, kava was the name for any drink made from plants, but it ended up being the origin of the word coffee, just because coffee was one of the more popular drinks made from plants. It finally spread from Ethiopia to Yemen, and the city of Mocha in Yemen was a center of coffee, and its name has remained a very important part of coffee culture. And when it made it to the Arabian world, they were preparing it in two different ways. They would make a tea out of the dried husk that was called kishir that didn't become as popular, and then bonya or bunchum was their version of coffee. In the 14th century, they started roasting coffee, and that made it taste better, and it led to a rapid increase in its popularity. And as coffee became more popular, you needed a place to drink it and get it. So coffee houses, those two words, started to open up in the Middle Eastern world. And by 1510, coffee was being consumed in Cairo and Mecca. And then there's a theme as coffee and coffee houses are introduced to different areas. There's an initial, everyone loves it, and then people in power start to wonder if maybe it's not okay, and they try and ban it, and then it takes over anyway because people just love coffee. So in 1511, Khair Beg, who was the chief of police in Mecca, tried to ban coffee because he thought it was sacrilegious and would result in vice. And that lasted for a year until he was replaced and then was unbanned. In 1555, coffee made it to Constantinople. And there again, there was initial backlash against it by leadership. Murat III, who was Sultan there, tried to ban coffee houses. He said it's because when you roast coffee, it makes it into a coal, and carbonized substances are not allowed for human consumption. But really, it's probably because Murat III gained power by murdering his entire family, and he was concerned that people in coffee houses would discuss that, maybe try and overthrow him. And despite that, by 1573, there were more than 600 coffee houses in Constantinople. Other leaders in the Middle East tried other ways to decrease the amount of sedition that would come from coffee houses. Some people would hire religious speakers to go to coffee houses and try and distract people from political discussions. And other leaders just hired spies to go sit at coffee houses and report back so they could at least see what was going on in their realms. But within a few centuries, if you weren't providing enough coffee to your wife, it was grounds for divorce in Cairo, which I thought was interesting. But slowly, coffee started to make it to Europe and the Western Hemisphere. Just before 1600, first coffee beans made it to Europe. And reportedly, again, this is probably not true, but in 1605, Pope Clement VIII baptized coffee. His concern was since it was from the Middle East, it was maybe like a heathen drink. but he said it was too good for non-believers to drink it only. So he baptized it and made it okay for the Catholic Church. In 1624, coffee was being commercially shipped to Venice, and in 1664, King Louis XIV was first exposed to coffee. And shortly after that, there's a story that in 1669, Suleiman visited Paris, and he was introduced to King Louis XIV, who was interested in him. So he ended up renting a house and staying nearby the court. And the women of society were really interested in what was happening just because he was an exotic person with an exotic house. So they would go visit in his house, and while they were visiting, they'd be given coffee. And these women had no exposure to caffeine before, so with a little bit of coffee, they were very hyper and talked a lot. And he was able to spy on the French court basically through them. But for a while, coffee wasn't very popular in France. People would alternate between a Turkomania, where they were dressing up in Turkish garb and drinking lots of coffee and not caring at all about it. But then by the time we got to Louis XV, Madame de Berry, who's pictured here, was really into the Turkomania, and she had herself painted as a sultana being served coffee, and that led to a lot of interest in coffee and an increase in its popularity. One of the things that really slowed down its ability to spread through Europe was that at this point in time, coffee production was dominated by Yemen, and because coffee is so temperamental, it's hard to grow it in other places. And they were fairly secretive about it, so it was also hard to get coffee beans to try and grow other places. But finally, just before 1700, the Dutch were able to successfully grow coffee on Java, which again, its name was linked with coffee for a long time after that. Within a little over a decade, they were able to start sending shipments of coffee back from Java. And again, it does take a long time for a coffee tree to start producing coffee, so that's why there's that delay. But shortly thereafter, it started becoming really popular. In 1715, France was requiring all the landowners in the island of Bourbon to plant 200 coffee trees for every slave that they owned. And by 1727, coffee made it to Brazil, in the Caribbean, and at the end of the 17th century, Haiti was producing half of the world's crop of coffee. And a Dutchman said in 1724, its use has become so common in our country that unless the maids and seamstresses had their coffee every morning, the thread will not go through the eye of the needle. I think that kind of stayed that way. So as in the Middle East, coffee houses started popping up in Europe in the 17th century. Most of the time, a couple would open up and fail. But finally, in 1689, Francois, back last name, opened a cafe that was really popular. He focused on upper class patrons, especially artists. So actors, musicians, writers would go there, talk to each other, and share ideas. And people like Voltaire, Rousseau, Benjamin Franklin, Victor Hugo, Robespierre, and Napoleon Bonaparte all went to this specific cafe. And by the time we got to Madame de Berry, there were 600 cafes in Paris. And the story of how coffee got to Vienna is that in 1683, Turkey was laying siege to the city of Vienna. And because of the work of some informants, especially George Kościcki, who was a Polish spy, they're able to get an upper hand and quickly chase away the Turkish forces. And Mr. Kościcki was well-traveled and knew about coffee. And when the city of Vienna was trying to pay him, he asked for the camel fodder that the Turkish forces had left behind, knowing that it was in fact coffee beans. And the story is that he used those coffee beans to open up a coffee house in Vienna and then made coffee popular by adding in sugar and milk, which I think was a good move forward. In reality, he actually had to petition the city leaders multiple times to be able to open a coffee house just because he was not from Vienna. And at that point, there are also probably several coffee houses in Vienna, but his story sounds way better. But we'll talk about it. Germany was a little bit slower to join the coffee trend, and that's probably because their first exposure to it came in 1631. A Dutch businessman sent one of his partners in Germany some coffee beans, and his wife decided that instead of using water to make the coffee, she tried chicken broth, and it tasted terrible, and people were not interested in it for a while afterwards. However, eventually coffee did start making a comeback. And coffee houses started to open, and then it became a regular thing for people to be drinking coffee. Some people, specifically Frederick the Great, were not huge fans of that. One, because he wanted to have a state monopoly on coffee so that they could get all of the money from it, and two, because another popular beverage in Germany is beer, and if people were drinking coffee, they weren't drinking beer, and he didn't love that. So he actually outlawed coffee shipments that weren't through the state and hired coffee sniffers to go around black markets to try and find black market coffee roasters. But despite that, coffee did stay popular in the rest of the country and eventually the entire country. And just kind of a little side note, because coffee was so popular, but there wasn't a great way to actually brew it. A German housewife in the early 1900s ended up inventing the filter drip coffee pot. And then she and her husband worked with a local metalsmith and made some prototypes, and they sold thousands at a local trade fair. And then her husband ended up starting a company that he named after her, Melita, in 1912, and that's still a very common coffee maker brand. No. Moving over to England, the presumption is that coffee wasn't popular in England until after 1616, just because Shakespeare was really good about having up-to-date cultural references, and he doesn't talk about coffee. So it must have gotten popular after he stopped writing. The first time someone's known to serve coffee in England is around 1637. It was Nathaniel Konopios. He was from Constantinople. He worked for the upper echelon there, but his boss got strangled and he was concerned that he would be next. So he decided to flee to England and move to Oxford, where he started serving coffee. And in 1650, the first coffee house opened in Oxford. Kind of an important side note at this point, this is before the Turkish siege. So at this point, coffee does not taste good, and it's filled with grounds, and people are only drinking it for its stimulant effect. It's basically like a drug. So the people who are drinking it a lot of times are people who like to experiment. So in 1655, a group of those people formed the Oxford Coffee Club. And those people include Hans Sloane, who is the founder of the British Museum, Sir Edmund Halley of the Comet, and Sir Isaac Newton of Calculus. So thanks tons for that. They would do lots of experiments and reported to have dissected a dolphin on a table in the coffee house with an audience, which I think speaks to the different kind of times they lived in. I don't think that would go over well now. But that coffee club ended up going on to become the Royal Society of London. So they eventually did get their lives together. But as was the trend everywhere else, coffee started off really popular, and then some people had some issues with it. Anthony Wood asked why we're not doing serious learning anymore, and he says it's because of coffee houses. And a lot of the wives of men who frequented coffee houses started calling themselves coffee house widows because they were alone all of the time. And in 1674, a group of women wrote the Women's Petition Against Coffee, representing to public consideration the grand inconvenience accruing to their sex from the excessive use of the drying and enfeebling liquor. The men who frequented the coffee houses weren't huge fans of that, and they retorted with the men's answer to the Women's Petition Against Coffee, vindicating their liquor from the undeserved aspersion lately cast upon them in their scandalous pamphlet. The following year, Charles II tried to ban coffee houses, but there was such a public outcry that within 11 days, he actually repealed that ban before it actually went into effect, noting his princely consideration and royal compassion. Again, probably just his desire to stay in power. But coffee houses did become a really important part and changing factor in education and literature, because people were getting together and talking rather than just reading from books. And because they were talking to each other, it changed the way poetry was written. It became more of like a prose and candid and conversational instead of just a single viewpoint telling somebody something. And it helped to transform literature into what we know today. Then coffee did cross the Atlantic around the same time that it got to Vienna. Dorothy Jones was the first person in the United States to sell coffee. We're not sure if it was the beans or the beverage, but still she wins. And the first coffee houses opened in Boston in 1689, and coffee houses were a really important part of the American Revolution. The Green Dragon was called the headquarters of the American Revolution by Daniel Webster. It's where Paul Revere and his friends planned the Boston Tea Party of 1773, and also probably marks the point where our country became more of a coffee country than a tea country. And up here is the Merchants Coffee House in New York. It's where the Sons of Liberty met to plan banning tea imports from England. And they wrote the draft for the first, or for the call of the First Continental Congress here. And then in 1789, after the Revolutionary War, they had a party to celebrate George Washington there. So coffee houses were really important in gaining us our independence. And as we became more dependent on coffee, we had a 7 times increase in the coffee we're importing after the Boston Tea Party and gaining independence, which some people weren't huge fans of. John Adams really wanted us to get away from tea, mostly because it was an English beverage. But in 1777, he wrote, "I hope the females would leave off their attachment to coffee." And they didn't. It's still very important. Just this is more because he wanted us to be independent from other countries, but we also don't like doing that. At the same time this is occurring, we were in the midst of what they call the gin epidemic. So at this point in history, people in the United States and England were drinking more alcohol than they had ever before in history and did ever after. And so people were trying to get people to drink less alcohol. One man, Benjamin Rush, who's a founding father, a physician, and the namesake of the county seat of the county that I grew up in, started an anti-alcohol movement in 1785, trying to get people to stop drinking gin. But if they weren't drinking alcohol, they had to be drinking something else, which led to an increase in the popularity of coffee here. And by the time we got to the Civil War, the word coffee was written more frequently in Union soldiers' diaries than the words rifle or bullets, which is, again, during the Civil War. They were more concerned about coffee. And Union soldiers were drinking 36 pounds of coffee a year, which is about 5 cups a day, every single day. So maybe we could have been more efficient with our time use during the war. And just as coffee shaped our country, it shapes a lot of the countries around us. So at the end of the 17th century, Haiti was producing half of the world's coffee crop, but it gained its independence from France in 1804, which led to a lot of changes politically. The United States was still a fairly young and weak nation at this point and didn't really want to make Napoleon Bonaparte angry, so it stopped trading with Haiti, but we had a coffee addiction, so we needed to get it from somewhere. So we started trading with Brazil. And Napoleon switched his sights from the Caribbean and Haiti to in Europe and started targeting Portugal for invasion after he lost control of Haiti, which then led the Portuguese court to flee from Portugal to Rio de Janeiro. And once they got there, they needed a way to make money, so they set their sights on coffee. Prior to them moving to Brazil, Rio de Janeiro was producing just enough coffee for consumption locally, but by the 1830s, it had taken over and was producing 50% of the global supply. In order to do that, they had to burn down 3,000 square miles of forest to make their plantations. Also, in order for them to run their plantations, they needed labor, and we didn't have a lot of money, but we were able to trade them slaves for coffee. And so we ended up with our coffee needs, leading to a very strong slave society in Brazil. By 1850, there were 2.5 million slaves in Brazil. But around that time, the tides were changing and people were becoming more against slavery. So in 1871, they passed the law of the free womb so that any children born to slaves were citizens. And at that point, it was impossible for them to continue having slaves. But it wasn't officially abolished until 1888. So as Brazil is no longer able to support the coffee trade, it has to shift somewhere else. And conveniently for Central America, it opened up as a place to make coffee. In the 1820s, a lot of small countries in Central America gained their independence from Spain, and they needed a way to make money. Prior to this, their land was communally owned. People worked together. They would just go out and eat their tropical fruits and vegetables that they were growing and work together. And it seems like they're very happy, but as our society can't stand that, we had to do something about it. Coffee was one of the more important exports at that point, but still not a lot of people were growing it. And indigo is another important export. But the decision was made to shift more towards growing coffee. So from 1860 to 1890, the number of acres planted with coffee trees increased by 50 times, and coffee production tripled in just a decade from 1880 to 1890. And conveniently for Central America in the 1880s, there was a fungus blight that really impaired the coffee production in Java and Sri Lanka. Their production decreased by as much as 85%. And this really gave Central America a chance to dominate the coffee trade. And something else that helped them is that at the beginning of coffee trade, you judged coffee just based on how the bean looked. It didn't matter how the coffee tasted. So they added cup testing later in the 19th century, and they found that the coffee from Brazil was actually not as good as coffee from pretty much anywhere else. So coffee started being categorized as Brazilian or mild, and that gave Central America an upper hand in selling their food. As we get towards the Great Depression, it becomes apparent that this is not a sustainable way for us to be getting coffee. In 1925, E.A. Call, who was vice president of the San Francisco Green Coffee Association, was speaking to the Housewives League of San Francisco. and said, were coffee produced at anywhere near our normal day wage, roasted coffee would probably cost us $1.50 a pound, at which point it was a third of that. He said that we believe probably enlightened the coffee buying public would not want to have cheap coffee solely at the expense of nearly slave labor in the producing countries. And at this point, a laborer on a coffee plantation was getting 15 cents a day and 2 meals a day, which was 2 corn tortillas with black beans and then salt, and that was it. However, he thought too highly of us, as people tend to, and we weren't the ones that made the move to try and improve situations for workers in Central America. It was actually themselves. Starting with the Great Depression, coffee prices dropped by 60%. Unemployment skyrocketed and went up to about 40% in rural areas. People running coffee plantations were trying to do it with the bare minimum number of people and paying them the same amount as they had before, which led to a lot of discontent. In December of 1931, the Salvadoran president was overthrown. There were lots of labor strikes. And in January 1932, there was an uprising by the Salvadoran people, and it was mostly run by communist socialist leaders. During the first phase of that uprising, 4,800 people died. Following that, people were given ID cards, which they said were just for identification purposes, but it really helped them target natives for murder. And in that next phase, 10,000 to 40,000 people were executed. It also set the stage for how our relations with Central America were. After this uprising, the US recognized General Martinez as a legitimate president of El Salvador. And so other leaders were under the impression that if you were able to gain power by whatever force you had to, then you would be in charge and America would recognize you. So coffee led to some less happy things in Central America. Modern day coffee, to lighten it up, coffee breaks are something we all know and love, but they didn't start happening in the 1600s when coffee did. The first time it's really documented is in 1918 in Cleveland. The Tyler Company bought 3 35-gallon percolators and every day used 22 pounds of coffee and 6 gallons of creamer, enough to make 500 men coffee for their coffee breaks. And the boss there said, you can't overestimate the necessity of maintaining the quality in the coffee served, because giving men poor coffee is the same as getting a poor grade of oil for a delicate machine, which I think is a really important thing for everyone in leadership to remember. But still, coffee breaks weren't standardized. So it varied how long they were, whether or not people had them or they were required. But that became a point of contention in 1955. Los Wigwam Weavers in Denver was a time-making company, and initially they hired young men to run old-fashioned looms, and it was fairly demanding work, but with the Korean War, they lost all of the young men that worked there. So first they tried hiring old men, but they just weren't as good. So then they tried hiring middle-aged women, which seems like the natural progression. And the middle-aged women actually did a fairly good job, but they were exhausted at the end of the day, and the next day they came in, they were still tired. So they were trying to figure out ways to keep them energized. So Phil Grinitz instituted 2 mandatory 15-minute coffee breaks each day, in the morning and afternoon. And with those 2 coffee breaks, the middle-aged women were able to do as much work in 6.5 hours as the older men could do in 8 hours. And so it was built into their contracts. If you worked there, you had to take these breaks. But you didn't get paid for them because you weren't working, and because they weren't getting paid for that time, their wages actually dipped below the minimum set by the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which caught the eye of the Department of Labor. So in 1955, the Department of Labor sued them. Initially, Los Wigwam Weavers won, saying that because the people weren't working, they didn't have to be paid. But the Department of Labor appealed, and in the circuit court, the Department of Labor won, saying that, 1, the nature of the break being 15 minutes in a building where they don't have an elevator, it makes it where they can't leave. And 2, the break actually benefits the business as much as it benefits the worker. So businesses were required to pay for the time people were taking coffee breaks. It was an interesting move. And then as we make it later into the 20th century, we start going through different ways of coffee drinking. Initially, when you bought coffee, you would buy it in bulk from neighborhood grocers. It was cheaper that way. You didn't know the brand, you didn't know where it's from, you just got coffee. Starting around the First World War, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company started opening economy stores where they would sell 3 brands of packaged coffee. 8 o'clock was the cheapest and most popular, then they had a middle brand, and then Bokar was their fancy one. So people were able to start picking out a brand that they liked. And then chain grocery stores started taking over by the time we got to World War II, and supermarkets began to pop up, which led to the first wave of American coffee drinking, just because you were able to have a lot more variety in the brands that you liked, and how much you could buy and fit in your car. The second wave was in the 1990s, with chain coffee shops like Pete's and Starbucks popped up. And the third wave that we're kind of entering now is a farmer-obsessed coffee movement. So there are cafes in some bigger cities where you can go and they can give you a coffee and tell you all about like where that coffee bean was grown and the farmer that grew it. And it's really farmer focused. So it just kind of shows a transition of our interest in coffee. So in conclusion, coffee helped transform literature to its modern form. Coffee helped to shape the political and economic structure of the Western Hemisphere, and coffee is delicious and got me through residency. And that's all that I have. Thank you.